The human brain cannot multitask. It's just task switching. And different people have different multitasking costs, we call it, right? A better ability to switch back and forth. But for almost everybody, that's still much more stressful than doing one thing at a time.
That's really interesting. I want you to succinctly put that. Are you saying that humans are unable to multitask? This is the Performance People podcast, brought to you in partnership with JP Morgan Private Bank. If you like what you see and hear, please do subscribe because it really makes all the difference. With me this week, today's guest is Dr. Tommy Wood.
Hello.
I'm just going to preface what I say next with, I think the next 60 minutes are going to blow my mind, let alone everybody else that is listening or watching to this podcast. I mean, so far on this book tour that you've been on to promote the stimulated mind, here we go, people. That's what it looks like, or what it will look like. You have been on everyone's podcast. So I feel very, very privileged to have you here with us in our studio in London. But I mean, prior to me, there was kind of Dr. Chatterjee and Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan. I mean, first of all, what did that feel like?
It was basically exactly as you might expect. He's got a very certain style that everybody's familiar with.
Yeah.
He's a very good interviewer. Like I was episode 2,450. Right? So he's done it.
He's got some practice.
Each one is 3 hours long or something. So he's really good at getting you in the zone, knowing what you want to talk about. And yeah.
And it gets flipped around super quick, right?
Oh yeah. No editing, goes out right the next day. And occasionally, he'll just like say some stuff out there and you've got to kind of figure out how to sort of mold the conversation around that. But yeah, it was a super interesting experience.
There's plenty to live up to over here. I really want to get you on one of the things that he did speak about, because I sort of absorbed all of that and love listening to you in conversation with him. But he had a really interesting point about personal responsibility, which we're going to get to a little bit later. I want to start with, you start this book by saying, well, it's sort of the tagline, future-proof your brain from dementia and stay sharp at any age. Let's start there. Future-proof your brain from dementia. Is that a thing? Is that possible? Can we do it?
Absolutely. And I think even beyond that, and within the book, a lot of the ideas are based around performance right now and what we can do to improve our cognitive performance on a day-to-day basis. Plus, the really big bonus that doing that will decrease your risk of dementia long term. The current estimates suggest that somewhere between 45% and maybe 70 or even more percent of dementias are preventable. When you think about dementia as a broad category, it is the loss of cognitive function to the point where you're no longer able to look after yourself on a day-to-day basis. There are several types of dementia, but the two most common are Alzheimer's disease, which makes up sort of 60 to 80% of dementias, and vascular dementia, which makes up 10 to 20%. Between the two of them, right, then that's 70 to 90%. And it's probably most of those that appear to be preventable.
When you say that, what tends to be the reaction from people? Because for those of us not in your community or in your space, that sounds extraordinary. Like my understanding of dementia is very limited. I fortunately have not been, in or surrounded by people that have suffered from it. But that feels really striking as a number and something quite surprising.
Yeah, and I think that really surprise is the most common response. Sometimes there is some pushback against it, which I also understand, because if people have a personal connection to dementia, they had a family member or a loved one who had dementia, and then I show up and say, hey, the majority of dementias may be preventable, people can internalize that as some kind of blame that somebody else got dementia, which is absolutely not the case, right? I truly believe that each person is doing the best with the knowledge they have at the time. For a long period of time, we thought that dementia was kind of in our genes. It was inevitable. Cognitive decline was something that we were going to experience, and there was nothing that we could do about it. And so first we have to think about the fact that this is even possible. And we have to know that because it requires us to engage in a whole number of processes and think about some of our risk factors and change those if we want to see our dementia risk come down. So first we need to believe it's possible, and then we need to know what we need to do, and then we need to engage in that. But equally, some of the dementias that are thought to be preventable are due to factors that one individual may not have control over. Level of education, socioeconomic status, and social stresses play a big role as well. So there are certainly things that all of us can do to dramatically decrease our dementia risk, but some of it is going to require change at the societal level.
And one of the things that's really interesting that you talk about as well, and we can sort of talk more on this subject now, is the fact that, just because a family member has it or there's a genetic disposition doesn't necessarily mean that has to translate. I mean, that takes a while to sort of scramble your mind around. Mm-hmm. Just explain why that is.
There's probably two main reasons. Maybe it's three, depending on how you split up genetics. So there are genetic risk factors for dementia. And the type of dementia actually that Alzheimer himself studied was what we now would call early onset Alzheimer's disease. So a single mutation in a single gene that causes very early and quite predictable loss of cognitive function in your sort of maybe starting in your 30s to 50s. But that's only about 1% of Alzheimer's disease. The other 99% late onset or sporadic Alzheimer's disease does have a genetic component. So there is one particular gene, the ApoE gene, apolipoprotein E, which is the most significant single genetic risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's. It comes in 3 different flavors, ApoE 2, 3, and 4. Mm-hmm. You get 2 copies of ApoE, so you can have any combination of 2s, 3s, and 4s. Compared to sort of the most common baseline risk, which is 3-3, those who have 1 copy of ApoE4 have about a 2 to 6 times increased risk of dementia. Those who have 2 copies have a 6 to 20 times increased risk. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that ApoE4 largely increases risk in interaction with environmental risk factors. So first of all, there are several populations around the world where having 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4 doesn't increase your risk of dementia. That includes the Bolivian Chimane, that includes the Nigerian Yoruba, includes some indigenous American populations. And those are just the ones that have been studied. So certainly there are several populations all around the world where ApoE4 doesn't increase risk. And
why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah.
So I think the next part explains most of it. Some of it can be maybe the overall ancestry and other genes that kind of buffer some of the risk. That it could be that. But when you look at how ApoE4 increases risk in sort of Western industrialized populations, it mainly seems to be a risk multiplier. So we know that excessive alcohol intake, a poor quality diet, being sedentary, these are risk factors for dementia. And your risk factor is greater if you have that risk factor and ApoE4. So it acts like a multiplier of risk. By the same token, though, if you address those risk factors, right, you're very physically active, you improve your diet quality, you take in more omega-3 fatty acids, which are an important risk factor, you get greater benefit because you're offsetting more of that risk. So I think most of it is an interaction between these other environmental risk factors and ApoE4, which does many things, but mainly it seems to increase inflammatory responses in the brain to stresses and exposures. So that means that if you do have an increased risk due to ApoE4, you can offset a large portion of that, if not all of that, by addressing all the individual risk factors. Then the other 2 reasons why you might have a family history or genetic risk of Alzheimer's, one is polygenic risk. So across thousands of different genes, they sort of add up to give more or less risk. And there are studies that show that regardless of your polygenic risk, if you address lifestyle risk factors, your risk will decrease. And then similarly, if you have a family history of dementia, that automatically increases your risk of dementia. But one of the reasons why dementia tracks in families is because of shared risk factors. So yes, there's genetics, but you're much more likely, you live in the same environment. And that can be the outdoor environment, the air, the water, how you eat, how you sleep, how you move. Those things are tend to be shared across families. And there was a study done using UK Biobank data that showed that. So again, there's going to be a genetic component, but a large portion of that seems to be modifiable based on these other factors that you have more control over.
So not only is there, in some cases, the ability to prevent dementia, but there's also an ability, as you say in the second part of this tagline, to stay sharp at any age, to actually, can the brain improve with age? Is that a thing as well?
Absolutely. So there are now dozens of studies across lots of different interventions to show that this is possible. They include physical activity, they include dietary changes. Some of the most impactful and some of the largest studies have done multiple things at the same time, which is probably going to have a bigger impact. So the best known was a study called FINGER. It was run in Finland. It's now about 10 years old. And they took individuals at high risk of dementia in their sort of 60s and 70s. And they had them do a few things. So they had a physical activity routine, so it was strength and aerobic training. They had dietary changes. They did some cognitive like brain training, and they monitored cardiovascular risk factors and treated them if necessary. And cardiovascular risk factors like high blood pressure and high blood sugar are two of the most important risk factors for dementia. Compared to a control group, they saw significant improvements in multiple aspects of cognitive function over a 12-month period. Then they just repeated FINGER essentially in the US. It's called the Pointer trial. And they found exactly the same thing, essentially. My favorite thing about Pointer, though, which you will like, is that they gave the participants a monthly budget to buy blueberries. And that was one of the ways that they improved.
Really?
That was one of the ways that they improved their diet quality.
How? Was it the European blueberry, though?
I don't think they specified. Obviously, it would have been much better.
The wild bilberry.
Vaccinium myrtillus is obviously what they should have been buying. Whether they did, I don't know.
It's fascinating, though, isn't it? Because we talk all the time about how, as we age, we need to keep an eye on our diet. We need to keep an eye on our sleep. We need to keep an eye on our training and muscle mass and all of these things. Very rarely do we talk about brain training.
Yeah.
Very rarely is that part of the conversation. I mean, perhaps it is at an elite level of understanding this space, but I don't think that's trickled down necessarily yet. Is that what you feel?
So yes and no. No, because everybody's said use it or lose it, right? They have some inkling that this is a thing, and I don't think it has to be formal brain training. So these trials use computerized brain training because it's something you can standardize and it's very easy to progress and you can measure how people are doing. But equally, there's a whole bunch of evidence that it could be a Tai Chi class. It could be a dance class. It could be playing a computer game, right? There's even interesting evidence there. And right, this is essentially the core thesis of my book, which is that how you use your brain is the primary determinant of how it will function, just like your physical body.
So in sport, we talk a lot, don't we, about how varied exercise is really important. If you keep running on that same treadmill for the same amount of time every single day, how much you really doing that, creates a good environment for yourself. Is it the same with your brain? Is it the same thing? If you keep going over the same things over and over again, you're not being as helpful to it as perhaps if you challenge it in many different ways.
Yes. For a few different reasons. I think when you look at the evidence for different types of physical activity or exercise and brain function, different types of exercise have different benefits for different parts of the brain. Yeah. So that's one reason why you need to sort of have a broad base. So aerobic type exercise, you're starting with just like walking. If you're not doing anything, right, just start with walking. We know that the number of steps you take every day, the more the better, to decrease dementia risk, up to sort of somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 steps a day. Then there are studies that show that brisk walking in older adults 3 times a week for 40 minutes significantly improves the size of the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's really critical for memory and hippocampal function. And so that aerobic type of exercise seems to be particularly good for the gray matter of the brain, which is around the outside and the cortex and sort of deep inside. And then particularly helps memory as a cognitive function. Then the more intensity occasionally is probably going to be beneficial as well. So there was I think probably the best study that's ever been done on exercise and cognitive function was published just over a year ago now. And they took individuals again in the sort of 60s and 70s, and they had them exercise 3 times a week. They had a control group, they had like a jogging group, and then they had a high intensity interval training group. They sort of, again, sort of 40 to 45 minutes, including a warm up and warm down. The high intensity interval training group did something called the Norwegian 4x4 protocol, if you've heard of that. So it's on a treadmill, 85 to 95% of maximum heart rate. They had then a 3-minute rest, and you do that 4 times over. They did that 3 times a week for 6 months. If anybody's tried the Norwegian 4x4 protocol, that is a brutal training program. But what they found was that in that group, they saw significant improvements in the structure and function of the hippocampus. And they did that for 6 months, and they retained the benefit 5 years later.
Wow.
Yeah. So like to follow them up for that long and still see that they retain that benefit, incredible. So intensity, it's probably to do with lactate production. Lactate has some really very cool effects on the brain, including upregulating the production of neurotrophic factors that kind of support neuroplasticity. But again, sort of focused on the hippocampus, focused on the gray matter and memory. When you then look at resistance training, that seems to be particularly good at improving the structure and function of the white matter, which kind of sits just underneath the cortex. It's where all our fast connections are made. Really important for things like executive function, fast decision making. There's this thing called response inhibition, which you can test in various ways, but it's basically like, when you have an urge to do something, but you stop yourself at the last minute, you're like, oh, I shouldn't say that. That's a bad idea. That's executive function. And resistance training seems to be particularly good for that. And that's probably because it releases something called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which is really important for white matter development. Actually, throughout your whole life is important in babies, and then it's important later in life. And then as like a final sort of icing on the cake, but equally could be part of those other two, is coordinative exercise. So where you're having to react to the environment, you're having to strategize, plan, right? You're playing a team sport or a ball sport, or a board sport where you're constantly having to sort of adjust. And those seem to be particularly beneficial for like overall cognitive function. So dancing, table tennis, paddle or pickleball in the US. And that's probably because there are very few times or activities as we get older, particularly, where we have to process information quickly.
Yeah.
And so it's maintaining that ability to do that by sort of responding to teammates, by trying to manipulate somebody on a court, by trying to strategize. I think that seems to be particularly good at maintaining those sort of core processing abilities in the brain as we get older. So across all of those different groups, you can sort of like hit every part of the brain and have a sort of a beneficial overall effect.
So that kind of looks at it from a performance related benefit basis. What about in recovery? Because we talk a lot these days about how performance actually, is training and recovery leads to ultimate performance, and prioritizing recovery a little bit more in a way that may not have been done in a sort of a casual setting. I think elite athletes have been doing this for a really long time, but I think to the layperson, it's just becoming a thing that actually they really understand that word better, and it doesn't have the negative connotations that it's had in the past. But how important is that as well for the brain?
Really, really important. So when in the book, I kind of liken the brain again to muscles, right? You want to get bigger, you want to get stronger. You need to apply a stimulus. That's doing some kind of cognitive training. It's doing some kind of creative hobby or skill. It's social interaction. But in order to then adapt and improve function, that only happens during rest and recovery, right? It's just like, you don't get stronger in the gym. You get stronger when you recover afterwards. And the brain is exactly the same. So that's where sleep is critical. But equally, just having a chance to take a break during the day can have a massive impact. So I think the title of the book is quite provocative, because we are simultaneously understimulated and overstimulated at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think we're understimulated from a complex task, hobbies, skills, social interaction at a population level. but we're overstimulated in terms of multitasking, task switching,
everything,
multiple media things at the same time, meetings, emails. And so we never give ourselves a chance to take a break, even during the day. And so that does multiple things. We never have the opportunity to do high quality focused work. And because of that, we're stressed the whole time because we're doing emails and in meetings when we should be doing this other thing, which we know creates a low level of stress. Plus the fact that we're often trying to do multiple things at the same time. The human brain cannot multitask. It's just task switching. And different people have different multitasking costs, we call it, right? A better ability to switch back and forth. But for almost everybody, that's still much more stressful than doing one thing at a time.
That's really interesting. I want you to succinctly put that. Are you saying that humans are unable to multitask?
Yes. So there's a very nice paper that came out a couple of years ago.
This isn't going to be concise, is it?
No, of course not. You asked me a question. Like never give a short answer when you can cite 12 papers and talk for 10 minutes. But I'll give you a soundbite at the end. How about that? There's this really nice paper called The Unbearable Slowness of Being, where basically they calculated how fast humans process information, and it's about 10 bits per second, which if you compare that to like your Wi-Fi, it's like 0.0001% of that, right? Human brains actually process information very slowly and sequentially. So if you think about a chess grandmaster, they think about all the moves sequentially. They're not thinking about multiple moves at the same time because we can't. The human brain is incapable of doing that. And so when we're trying to do multiple things at the same time, we are essentially just constantly flicking back and forth. And every time you do that, there's some downtime where you have to like get yourself back in. Plus, there's this thing called attentional residue, which is I'm now back to thinking about this other thing, but I'm still kind of thinking about this thing back here. And when we do that with multiple different types of media, which is very common now, right? I'm on Instagram while I'm watching Netflix. The brain adapts to it. So there are studies that show that you can become better. You can become better at that. You can become better at doing two things at the same time. But at the same time, you become more distractible.
Yeah.
Because the brain is now thinking, I need to be on the lookout all the time for something else that's going to happen in my peripheral vision and then process two things at the same time. So this is all just the brain adapting to the exposures you give it to. And you can go in the other direction as well. But in reality, everything that we do involves just one process at a time. When I've heard people say, oh, of course humans can multitask because they can eat and watch TV at the same time. That's true. Like an adult human is capable of shoveling food into their mouth whilst watching TV.
So is a child.
But then ask them how much they ate afterwards, and they have no idea. So you can only do one thing that requires your full attention and focus at a time. If you can then walk at the same time, it's not this, usually it's an automated process that's sort of like running in the background. But if you really want to focus on anything, you can only do one thing at a time.
So what is social media doing to our minds? I mean, that is a very, very, that could be a very long answer. But the point being is that if we're talking about overstimulation and understimulation in the same sort of context as one another, surely that has a lot to bear.
One of the reasons for that is because of the way we use it, right? If you were just using social media and you were just using it as a small defined break, actually that's not that much. That's not that big of a deal.
Just a switch off.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And there are actually studies that show that in a work day, you can get very quick recovery in terms of mental fatigue and like vigor to go and do complex work by like watching 5 minutes of comedy clips on YouTube or something. So that could be 5 minutes.
But we get stuck in a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And then what?
But if you just do like 5 minutes of watching dogs playing in the snow, which is what like half my Instagram feed is right now, that's fine. Like actually, it's a good mental break.
Have you curated it so that it goes that way?
So this is one of the things you have to do is you have to curate the feed.
Yes. So it suits you to switch off.
Because what our brain is doing the rest of the time is it's prioritizing social information that is either moral and or emotional. So there's this thing called prime information, prestigious, in-group, moral, and emotional. And this is what we as humans prioritize in terms of information, right? It helps our social fitness. We're more likely to survive. And so by following rich, famous, more jacked people, what you're constantly doing is trying to understand where you place yourself, where you place in the world. You're usually demoting yourself relative to the rest of the world. That is inherently stressful. And you're much more likely to respond and get these bigger dopamine swings, which makes the brain think you're learning something important. A big dopamine swing is what tells the brain that you're learning something important. If something is emotional or very evocative, or it gets some kind of response from you. So you have to then curate your feed so that you're not constantly being exposed to these things that then cause these big dopamine swings that make your brain think, oh, this is really important because of the social nature of it. So this is all possible.
Do you think people will do that? Do you think they'll get there? Or do you think they might even get to a point where they have two different feeds? One which is set up because so many people use it for work and business. Yeah. So you can understand how, they have to have it set up a particular way. But actually for personal growth and for sanity's sake, maybe it needs to be
I know there are some like business consultants who say you should only have one Instagram profile, right? Because like just to build this one thing. But I think it also potentially makes sense to be like, this is the business one. This is what that feed looks like. This is my personal one. And you just fill it with
dogs running around in the snow or whatever it might be. Snow.
But like, this is, Instagram or TikTok. But some of the more traditional social media, so think about Facebook when it first started, there was actually a lot of net benefit from it because you were connecting with people, sharing photos, communities. Yeah. So they did studies on health communities on Facebook where people felt supported. They were navigating some kind of lifestyle change or navigating some kind of disease. And actually, it was a net benefit. Then, of course, it switched over to be more about consumption rather than connection. But these sort of like underlying parts of social media are still there if we choose to focus on them.
But we have to make the choice actively.
Absolutely.
AI. Is AI going to kill off all our brain cells?
This again, unfortunately, requires conscious choice. Because the answer could be yes, and it could be no. So when you look at, and what's most frustrating, but also most interesting is that whatever I say right now is going to be out of date in 6 months' time.
In about 10 minutes.
Yeah, probably. Like by the time we finish talking, like there'll be some new algorithm that's doing this new amazing thing. But when you look at the data that exists so far, they're exactly as you'd expect. So if you have students use a large language model to write an essay, there's less connectivity and functionality in the areas of the brain associated with that task. They feel like they have less ownership over the end material, and they remember it less well. Of course, because their brain didn't actually do the work. But
I mean, we remember that from schoolwork.
Yeah.
Right? Like when we literally used to just write out the same thing again and again and again on a page and hope to memorize it. And you'd do it for the exam and you'd get an A.
Yeah.
And then you'd leave 2 weeks later and you wouldn't remember or retain any of it.
But at least there was a moment in time when you had mastery over the material.
Yeah.
Whereas now that there's a risk that won't happen. But when you look at so in the same studies, so this is this big study that came out of MIT that sort of like everybody got really worked up about. What they found was that if you have a student write an essay and first they have to write it using whatever gray matter they've got kicking around upstairs.
So all by themselves.
Yeah. They write it first. And then afterwards, they get to write it again with the help of, I think they use ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Then in the end, the product is better and they feel greater ownership of it. So the question that
So they're supplementing their knowledge.
Yeah. So the sort of the fancy term is a cognitive orthotic, right? You have to actually engage your brain. But then once you've created the thing that you can create, you say, what did I miss? What else should I be thinking about? How can I build on this? Right. And then you can actually learn, you're engaged in that process, right? You're sort of like having this tool to sort of bounce ideas off of. And then the end result may be better and you may actually learn something.
Yeah, but how many people are going to do that versus just use it because it's easier?
No, I mean, so that's the risk, because when you look at people nowadays using these tools to write their emails in my field, you've got people whose AI designs the experiment, analyzes the data, writes the paper. I'm like, no science was done by humans here. Like, no skills were developed. And I think that's a real risk. If you don't continue to engage those skills, they will atrophy, right? And we know that, decades of neuroscience shows that you challenge your brain with a new skill or activity, you will improve the functionality of the parts of the brain that drive that skill and function. You maybe even change the structure of the brain as you do it. But if you stop doing it, those changes regress. So if you don't engage in these skills that you want yourself to have, you will either never develop them or you'll lose them.
It's a little bit terrifying. Will our children think the same way that we think, or will they think differently because of AI?
So I don't always think that thinking differently is bad, right? It's just, you have to consider the core skills that you want your brain to have, be that critical thinking, different aspects of memory, be it just like actual knowledge.
But will they ever get the opportunity to train their brains in that way?
So,
because we have before and after.
There's this big shift now in several countries to move away from iPads and computers and these other tools in classrooms and move back to writing by hand, which has its own special benefits for the brain. So I think we're kind of moving back in that direction. There are adults now, you heard the personal curriculum thing where people like pick a new skill they want to learn. It could be knitting or making sourdough bread or something. Like, people are now starting to go back to these more analog kind of skills, because I think they know that these are really the things that human brains excel at and almost crave in order to function at their best. But there's going to be some kind of shift in overall how we use information and access it. So there was a really interesting study where they coined the term Google effect, which was run by Betsy Sparrow. And what they did is they had people learn some information and save it on a computer. And then either they thought the computer will save it and they can access it later, or they thought the computer's going to delete it and I'm not going to be able to go and find it afterwards. In the former scenario, what people remember is where the information is rather than the information itself.
Yeah.
And in the latter, they actually remember the information itself.
Because they have to.
So I'm not sure one is better than the other. And you can still remember. It's just your memory is having to adapt to the tools that you have in front of you. And so I've noticed this myself, right? I, at any given time, have to have access in my brain to thousands of papers because somebody might ask me about it, or I put them in the book. I can't remember the details of all those papers. Like the amount of scientific information that I have to retain is more than most people ever in history. But I remember where those studies are, so I can remember enough details to go back and find them and get the details again. I don't think my memory is worse. It's just different. And I still train it and I still use it. So I think it's okay if some of these things shift, but we still need to make sure we're maintaining these sort of like core parts of cognitive function that are going to be important, in multiple different scenarios.
But you alluded to it a moment ago, which was really, really interesting. I want to touch on it further. Will the brain structure and its development change with AI now on the table?
So I think it will, again, depend on how we engage in it. So if we think about complex skills more broadly, and we think about some of the core functions of the brain that we want to maintain. So we sort of mentioned in passing earlier, like processing speed, just like the ability to handle information quickly and manipulate it and have some kind of outcome. We're going to need to do tasks that require us to do that. And there are a whole bunch of different ways to do that, but we will need to engage in tasks that like sort of challenge our processing speed. Just like we'll need to engage in tasks that challenge our memory. And we have to learn some actual knowledge about the world. But across complex skills, they seem to have some very core effects on the brain, such that it matters less what you do, it just matters that you do it. So an example is, there was a nice study recently called Creative Experiences and Brain Clocks. And what they did is they looked at a whole bunch of different creative skills. And they had visual artists like painters, they had tango dancers, they had actually video gamers, and one of the data sets that they had included a randomized control trial where they had people learn a video game, and they had musicians. And when you look across all these groups, gaining expertise in a complex skill that requires you to process information for multiple senses quickly has they all had very similar effects on these networks in the brain that are susceptible to the processes of aging. Like the frontal parietal network is really important for like attention and memory. And so what I think that says is that even in the age of AI, if we do things that still require us to process information in that way, I think we're going to be okay. But that still requires a little bit of effort on our part.
Yeah, it does. It requires what you could term as personal responsibility, which brings me to the same point that Joe Rogan made, which is, why can't people just do it? I mean, you give them wonderful, programs and ideas and tips and tricks to improve brain quality and function as people age. But, there are a whole chunk and proportion of people that won't do it, right? Why can't they just do it? That was his point, taking proper responsibility for it. But you had a different response to that. Can you share that with us? Because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that in many areas, there is sometimes this idea that our individual health and our health trajectory is all just down to what we do, and we can change it if only we just weren't so lazy. Of course, many of these things require conscious effort, but you also have to consider the different environments we grew up in, the different resources and time that we have available to us, different literacies that we might have in these different areas. Like, I can give you a resistance training program, but you might be like, I don't understand these words on a page. Like, what is a chest press? Like, I have no idea. And you might give somebody a whole, a diet plan to follow or recipes, and they're like, I can't cook, or I don't have a kitchen, or I work 3 jobs, I don't have time. And then you layer on top of this huge amounts of stress that can come from socioeconomic status, family stresses, financial stresses, that, do you know what? Cooking X meal or doing X workout is just like so far from that person's consciousness that they're never going to have the headspace to approach it. So yes, each of those things I think can be improved by all of us. And I think there are ways to make it accessible and affordable and understandable, but you always have to appreciate where that person is starting from. One thing that I don't get into much in the book, it's not really my area of expertise, but it's important to consider, is that there are a whole bunch of people out there who don't believe they deserve to be healthy, right? Either it's not something they've ever seen in their family, it's not something they've ever understood. There's some history of trauma that has made them feel like that it's not, they're not worthy of better health and better well-being. And so, like, starting from there, you're never going to engage in these things, right? People need therapy and they need help and support. And so more information is not going to be the answer. And just telling people to like pull your socks up and do it is not going to be helpful either. So
on the other side of that, on the other spectrum, you know, we've talked about this before. You can't just throw money at the problem either. No. You've actually got to do the doing. Yeah.
And I do believe that we have huge capacity to move the needle on all of these things. Some of it requires, you know, taking charge of your own health, of course. So you need both like top down and bottom up.
Yeah.
And I think one day somebody will crack the ability to support behavior change at scale. And that's when we're going to see really big impacts, because different people are motivated by different things. They need different levels of support. They need different levels of access to all these different things that we've talked about. So yeah, I think it's very easy for somebody who has all the time and money in the world to say, hey, just do it. But I don't think they understand. And right, those people include me, right? Yeah. I can do whatever I want.
Also, you've got that can-do attitude.
Yeah, but I have all the knowledge and financial resources and time to be able to do it. But you have to understand that that's not the case for the majority of people. And you really need to meet them where they are and support them to make any changes they want to make.
Yeah, it's a bigger piece of work. Do you know, I thought it'd be interesting, so I did it. I did ask ChatGPT to come up with 3 questions to ask you, because I just wanted to see whether it would be, well, it probably is far brighter than I could ever hope to be. But it amalgamated obviously several things online. So one of the questions was, is AI making us less creative even when we think it's helping us?
I think the probably like the true scientific answer I want to give you, I don't think we don't know yet. However, I will say that there are several examples of things where we feel like we're more creative, but we've uncoupled our subjective experience from like what's happening in the real world. So there are lots of psychoactive drugs, some legal, some illegal, where this happens. And I'll include, so like this is not a creativity one, but I'll include caffeine as one.
Yeah.
In general, if you consume a lot of caffeine, you feel great and you think like you're doing high quality work, but actually your complex skill performance is often going down. And it's the case for many different stimulants. And so they've done similar studies using cannabis or THC, where people feel super creative, right? This is my best work. But when you then go back and look at it objectively, it's actually less creative. So we can definitely get into a scenario where we kid ourselves that we're doing high quality creative work, and actually that's not the case. And I think we think something similar when it comes to productivity and some of these other tasks we have to do, work that we now use AI for. So I have several colleagues who I'm pretty sure all their emails are written by AI. Nowadays, when I go into my Gmail, it writes a response that I have to delete so that I can write my own response. Ridiculous. Like, you should be able to write an email. Like, I appreciate we're busy, but like, this is an important type of communication. And the people who write their emails this way, I believe they think they're doing a good job. They're being empathetic. They're writing something longer. It shows they're more interested. As a receiver, I know that was written by AI. That means that this guy can't even spend 5 minutes to write me an actual email. And so I think this is going to happen with creativity. I think it's going to happen with all these different tasks where we think we're doing a great job. And the person on the other end is like, seriously, this, like, I know you got ChatGPT to do this for you.
It's a good explanation. Second question, and this is a good one actually. What does neuroscience say happens to the brain when we stop thinking from scratch? That's a really interesting one. If you think about editing a piece of work rather than actually starting a piece, when you think about writing your book, like starting it from a place where, you know, the beginning, the first page has to be the hardest.
So I think that that question maps quite nicely onto that study we were talking about earlier, right? If you start it from scratch and you build something based on what you can do currently, and then you sort of have additional tools to build on that, that's still something you feel ownership of. You've developed some skills. You've had to put some thought into it. If it's the other way around and you just give up, we will just become professional ChatGPT prompt writers, right? Then you're losing that engagement. You're losing the activity of the brain networks, right? They measured that, and that's in that study. Those networks in the brain required for those critical aspects of synthesizing information, focusing, paying attention, doing the task, they're not even being activated anymore because we're not having to activate them. So we know that focus is a muscle. We know that attention, processing speed, complex skills, right? All of them require ongoing challenge and maintenance. And so if we never engage them in the first place, we will lose those abilities if we ever develop them in the first place.
And final question, are we outsourcing our imaginations the same way that we did with GPS? I mean, I have this argument with my husband the whole time.
Yeah.
Stop plugging it into Waze and actually figure out how to get from A to B on your own terms, on the basis that otherwise you never learn where any street is in the country. You just don't. I mean, is that something we need to know? It feels like, if you spoke to any London taxi driver, it'd say absolutely. That, makes me redundant.
Yeah. To be fair, he's probably done a fair bit of navigation in his life. Of various kinds.
Across water.
But so there is something really interesting about spatial memory and navigation for the brain. And actually, most of the evidence comes from London cab drivers.
Wow.
So they've done a ton of studies looking at cabbies as they learn the knowledge. So when I'm in the US, I have to say what the knowledge is. So I'm going to say it anyway, for those who don't know, right? Yeah. It's memorizing 25,000 streets in a 6-mile radius around Charing Cross Station.
Which can take up to 7 years?
Yeah. So the average is sort of like 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
So one famous study followed 3 groups. They had cabbies studying for the knowledge, and then they had a control group. And these are sort of like men in, mostly men in their like 30s to 40s. And then those who studied for the knowledge either passed or failed. And what they did is they found that those who studied and passed, they saw significant changes in the structure of the brain on an MRI scan, particularly in the posterior hippocampus, which is really important for spatial memory. No changes seen in the group that failed, and no changes seen in the control group. Then there are studies that show that there was a recent study in the US that cab drivers and ambulance drivers have a significantly lower risk of dementia compared to all other occupations once you account for socioeconomic status and pay and all that other kind of stuff. And it's thought to be particularly because of all the work the hippocampus is doing, memorizing and
non-stop.
And moving you around in the world. So there is probably something quite magic about having to think about where you are in the world and navigating your way through it. We've obviously lost, most of us have lost most of that through GPS. And like, even when I tell the story about the London cabbies now, everybody's like, oh, I get in a cab and they just like put it in the GPS anyway. So like that has changed. I don't think that like GPS is going to increase everybody's risk of dementia, right? As long as you're doing some of these other things that we know are important. But yes, that type of using our brain does seem to be particularly beneficial.
Just want to touch on the athlete piece as well, because that's where you come at this from as well, having worked with many athletes over the years, particularly Formula One drivers. What do elite athletes have, or what do they understand in terms of cognitive function that the rest of us could sort of take away from them?
I think that the main thing you see again and again, particularly in athletes who are successful for long periods of time, right? Anybody who's worked with teenage phenom athletes knows that they can do anything, eat anything, train anyway, and they'll still be great. Because there's some genetic and other components that go into this. But those who sustain a career for 10 plus years, they become really good at knowing where their limitations are and addressing those with targeted training, or and then maintaining the skills they need to maintain with targeted training. And then they become much better at thinking about all the other things that support that adaptation. So nutrient status, sleep and recovery. And it's that kind of very focused training based on individual capacities. Like, what is the adaptation I'm trying to train today in this session, and knowing that, and knowing how that is going to relate to whatever it is you need to perform at. And then, like, no junk volume, no extra stuff. Then it's straight into recovery. How am I going to make sure I sleep properly? How am I going to make sure that I have all the nutrients on board that are going to help me adapt? And so I think it's this very tight pairing between the right type of stimulus plus then giving the body, all the opportunity it needs to like recover and adapt from it.
Yeah, I wonder whether you see real commonalities between the likes of Lindsey Vonn, who obviously had a disastrous Olympics, but what an amazing effort to go out there, and just put it all out there.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And I think regardless of what happened, everyone should salute her for giving it her best possible shot. It's just phenomenal.
Absolutely.
But her, Novak Djokovic, we look at, various different, Lewis Hamilton in Formula One still there or thereabouts, like these aging athletes that are still able to put it out there on the world stage, competing against far younger individuals, like you say, who have the ability to turn it off and turn it on as and when they want. I mean, what is it about them? What is it about their makeup, particularly how their brain works, that they keep themselves in that sort of high octane state?
There are a few things that I think happen. One thing that's very consistent across athletes who are successful for a long period of time is focus on the process rather than the outcome. And they are very focused on the process and getting that as dialed in as possible. And they enjoy it, because if you don't enjoy it, right, you're never gonna stick with it. So that's one thing. And then there's also the psychological ability to come back from setbacks and understand that people make mistakes, things happen, and treat yourself like a human being and come back to it again. And so this was actually something that I discussed with Joe Rogan, is sort of like some of these psychological aspects of elite performers. And again, like when I work in Formula One, we have psychologists, so I won't pretend that I'm an expert in psychology, but in the literature and then in some of these athletes, you see that self-compassion is one of the traits that makes you more likely to succeed for long periods of time. It's not the beat yourself up, David Goggins approach that will work for some people. For most people, it won't. You need to be able to have mindfulness, common humanity, understand that people make mistakes, understand that you can come back and do it again, understand where you've succeeded before and rely on that in the future, and actually be kind to yourself more than be hard on yourself most of the time. But then you also have to layer on, right, that they have very high levels of resolve, right, to come back, and resilience to come back. So all these pieces are needed. But I think it's that focus on the process. It's having a range of psychological skills to be able to like overcome setbacks, plus just like a willingness to have that be your primary focus for such a long period of time. And I think one of the main reasons why people drop off in their career is just because life happens, right? Or they made a lot of money and they're famous now and they want to do something else, and like that's fine, absolutely, that's great. You have new opportunities, you want to do new things. But
it's so interesting because when we talk about those really, really big names, they had the opportunity to drop off years ago.
Yeah,
but they still pursue what is effectively a really risky strategy.
Yeah, but that's what they love, and that's what they've decided. That's what they've decided to do. But then
makes them relatable, ironically.
Yeah, but I think the final thing that's worth thinking about there is that as you get older, and we see this in the rest of us as we get into our 50s, 60s, 70s. Not all cognitive functions decline. Something that keeps increasing into our sort of 6th and 7th decade is something called crystallized intelligence, which is a fancy neuroscience term for wisdom, right? Yeah. You become better at seeing the bigger picture, integrating multiple aspects, multiple types of information. And just like having a bit more intuition about a situation. So in Formula One, right, we had Sebastian Vettel, when he was at Aston, we had Alonso, right? Actually, now at Aston, you have Hamilton, first at Mercedes and then at Ferrari, right? Often beating a younger, fitter teammate, or maybe, some of them, they maintain the same fitness as they did when they were in their 20s, but they have so much better racecraft. They're much more patient. They understand things much better. So your brain changes, but it's actually not necessarily in a bad way, right? Yes, if I measured their absolute processing speed with an EEG, I'm measuring the electrical activity in their brain, it's probably slower than it was 20 years ago. But they can still perform at a very high level because they've adapted accordingly and then can take advantage of all the things that they've learned and experienced up to that point.
Let's end with what you begin with in the book, which is, and it relates to wisdom, which is the owl experiment. Because I often think of larks and owls because I'm often talking about night and day powder.
Yeah.
And actually what type of person you are, whether you're that morning person or that evening person, and what you respond best to, whether you're part of that 5 a.m. club or,
Yeah.
So just talk to us about this owl experiment that you start with in the book, because it sort of sets the tone for everything. And it's a good way to end.
Yeah. So this is the preface of the book, and it's based on a set of experiments done with barn owls at Stanford University, mainly run by a guy called Eric Knudsen. And what they did is they fitted barn owls with prism glasses. So prisms shift light, right? And there, you can look, if you look at these papers or you look online, there are these cool photos of owls wearing these kind of crazy looking glasses.
They look so wise.
Yeah. And so what it does is, because it shifts light, the owl is looking straight ahead, but what it's seeing is slightly shifted to the left or right. So where you see something is not where you think it is. And it creates a mismatch in the brain between the visual inputs and the internal map of the brain, or the internal map of the world in the brain that we all have. And what they originally found in the first studies was that if you put prism glasses on a young owl, they adapt very quickly. But if you put them on an old owl, they don't. And then you're just well, that's great. Adult brain can't change.
We jump straight to that conclusion.
We're all screwed. Yeah. But then they did a bunch of really interesting things that show that that's not the case, or it doesn't have to be. So in those first experiments, they were alone the owls were alone in a cage, and they were just food was just pushed towards them, right? It was dead mice, right? So you're alone in a cage and food just magically appears in front of you. You don't have to do anything for it. In the book, I call this the perfect metaphor for modern life, right? You just sit there doing nothing and food just shows up. But in one experiment, they housed the owls together. So they're socially housed. All of a sudden, you're having to interact with others. You're having to move around the environment and navigate other individuals. And then adult brains could adapt. And then in another experiment, they didn't feed them dead mice. They fed them live mice. So they had to hunt for dinner, right? So again, they had to engage in the environment. They had to navigate it. They had to figure out where this pesky mouse was. Right? They're looking ahead. They can't see it, or they can hear it whilst wearing these glasses. Yeah. And so they could measure in the adult animals these shifts in the brain happening as they went out and engaged in the world and their brains were forced to change, right? You want to not bump into your owl mate, or you want to eat dinner, the brain has to change. So what this basically says is that the adult brain is perfectly capable of change, but it needs a reason to. And this is actually perfectly reasonable, because your brain is at this moment the product of the environment and all the years leading up to it. It is kind of crafted itself in the image of the environment and how you use it. And so you don't want it to just change willy-nilly. It has to have a reason to change. But if you change it by challenging it and engaging the environment, the adult brain can change just fine. You just need to actually actively sort of engage in that process.
See, fundamentally, you can adapt.
Yeah.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started, which is dementia can be, if all of these different things are put into play, preventable.
Yeah, I think that the core idea, right, is that how you use your brain determines its function. You want your brain to perform better. You need to go out into the world and challenge it and use it to do complex and interesting things with, often with other people. And then you need to give it the time and the substrates it needs to adapt. You need to sleep properly. You need to give it the nutrients it needs. You need to like take care of your overall physical health. That then allows you to get the most out of that stimulus, just like, you know, training the muscle or body. All of those things together can significantly improve cognitive function, brain health at any age.
What are the 3 S's?
So this is
you go forgetting them.
Yeah, this is the 3S model, which kind of explains this whole thing: stimulus, supply, and support. Okay. So stimulus, how you use your brain. Supply, that's blood supply, so cardiovascular health. It's nutrient supply, you know, high quality diet, the nutrients we need: vitamin D, omega-3s, B vitamins, magnesium, things like that. And then support, giving the brain the time it needs to adapt and avoiding things that inhibit that process. So we've talked about sleep, but smoking, alcohol, air pollution, gum disease, all of these things can sort of impair some of these processes in the brain. But if we take care of those 3 buckets, actually we have massive capacity to improve our overall cognitive function.
I'm going to take proper responsibility, Joe Rogan style, and go and do it. Thanks, Tommy.
Thanks so much.